Airports are the 21st century crossroads. More than 8 million people travel by air every day, over 3 billion every year. We live in a time when air travel is available to almost everyone on the planet. Travel on this scale happened because of one thing: the jet airplane. Jets take off every second of every day. Some have 2 engines, some have 4. They come from Boeing, Airbus, Embraer, Bombardier, and others. But large or small, no matter the airline, almost all share a shape. The wings swept back from the fuselage, with the jet engines suspended beneath. It is a design so perfect that it has barely changed in over 60 years for all of the jet age. How this modern jetliner came to be is the story of 3 Boeing jets and secrets discovered in a German forest at the close of World War II. World War II in Europe pitted one country, Germany, against the armed forces of more than a dozen countries. But the German military believed it would be victorious. In secret, for over a decade, the Nazis had been developing what they called Wunderwaffen, wonder weapons.
The Germans had been investing huge amounts of money, time, and effort in the notion of super weapons, including the most advanced airplanes, designs, and research.
The Germans had built the world's first operational jet fighter, the Messerschmitt Me-262. It marked the beginning of a revolution in high-speed flight.
The advent of the jet engine allowed much higher thrust from the engines, which then would allow higher speeds.
The Me-262 was the fastest plane in the sky, but the German Air Force, the Luftwaffe, had been working on even more advanced designs.
At the tail end of the war, the Allies began to report, particularly from Germany, sightings of these strangely shaped German aircraft with swept wings.
Aircraft with wings that swept back from the body of the plane like an arrow. Every airplane since the Wright brothers had featured straight wings positioned perpendicular to the body of the aircraft.
At the end of the war, the Allies sent Boeing guys, and other folks too, in to find out what in the world was happening.
With the Nazi regime facing defeat, all of its expertise and technology were up for grabs.
There was a program called Lusty, which was a Luftwaffe secret technology project. There was a race to get this technology. Within hours of the advancing front, right behind both the Russian lines and the British and American lines in the West, were these teams of foraging scientists and technicians. Wherever they could find it, they would grab equipment, grab research, grab development tools, looking for these German breakthrough technologies.
The Lusty team was led by renowned aerospace engineer Theodor von Karman, a Hungarian Jew who had left Germany for America as Hitler came to power. The U.S. Air Forces had tasked von Karman with assembling some of America's best aviation minds for the mission. Among them was Boeing's chief aerodynamicist, George Schirrer. The team swept in, searching for what remained of the Nazis' aviation research centers.
They'd happened upon this advanced research facility hidden away in forests. So well hidden, in fact, that the entire war, the Allies never found it. It was like stumbling upon Disneyland for the engineers. They couldn't believe it.
It had been camouflaged to such a degree that even the rooftops had grass planted on them, and storks had actually built nests in the grass on the tops of the roofs, and no one in the U.S. Army Air Forces had ever heard of this institution, although it had been up and running for 10 years.
It was known as Wolkenrode, and it was German aviation's prized research center.
They met up with a custodian who was told by Hitler to blow up this whole area right away. And he had worked with the people developing it, and he just thought it was too nice, so he didn't blow it up. He took these guys down into the vault where all the data was.
Inside of it was incredible troves of information about flight that no one in America had been able to achieve. They had laboratories, they had jet fuel facilities, they had 7 wind tunnels, and they had work going on with a swept wing.
It was the swept wing that immediately captured the Americans' attention. The swept wing design suggested that the Germans had solved a problem that had stymied the British and the Americans, who had both built jet engines, but no planes that could take advantage of them.
The problem was when you used jet engines on a traditional airplane with straight wings, you would get up to speeds where the airflow over the top of the wing would be going supersonic, even if the plane wasn't, and that would cause shocks to form on the top of the wing, which would basically make it very hard to control. You'd lose lift, etc. By sweeping the wings, the Germans were able to delay the onset of these shocks on the top of the wing, and that allowed them to take advantage of the jet engine.
The swept wing data wasn't the only surprise the Americans found at Wolkenrode. They also found the man in charge, Adolf Bussmann, one of Germany's leading aerodynamicists, and a former colleague of von Karman's before the war. Bussmann was puzzled by their amazement over the swept wing.
In 1935, Adolf Bussmann had presented a paper on high-speed flight at an international conference in aeronautics, the so-called Volta Conference. When they met Bussmann, he reminded them that he had given this paper on swept wings that they had all forgotten about.
Many of the world's important aerodynamicists had attended the conference, including von Karman himself.
Very few people at the meeting paid attention to it. However, the Germans paid attention to it, and within a year, they classified the concept of the swept wing and initiated a great deal of laboratory wind tunnel research on swept wings.
George Schirrer immediately recognized the significance of the research at Wolkenrode.
He wrote a letter home telling the fellows, you better get in the wind tunnel and see what this is all about, because this is a way to fly airplanes fast.
Boeing was in a competition with 3 other companies to produce the next generation American bomber, a jet. It would be called the B-47. For nearly 2 years, Boeing had been working on a design with straight wings.
George Schirrer made the very gutsy call to immediately stop all design work on the B-47 project as it was then being pursued and transform it instead into a swept-wing bomber.
But changing to the unproven swept-wing configuration was a risk.
No one had any idea how to build a plane with a wing like that. Everybody knew that it could fly fast, but they didn't know how you could control that. They didn't even know if you could control it.
Having their own wind tunnel enabled Boeing to spend an enormous amount of time evolving the wing of the B-47. They all knew the swept wing was the way to go forward, but where do you put the engines?
Up until that time, virtually all airplanes had been designed with the engines embedded in the wing.
Boeing decided that was too dangerous because if something went wrong with the engine, it blew up, it would severely damage the airplane.
The Boeing designers had painful memories of the engine fires that had plagued the development of the B-29 bomber.
So they came up with this wild notion, which was really wild, of hanging the engines under the wings.
The radical new design would suspend the engines on struts, hanging below the wing in small pods.
Mounting them on pods needed a lot of detailed design work in the wind tunnel to get it just right. And it had to be just right. If you're a few percent out, you were in considerable trouble.
One of the most feared words in the development of aircraft is something called flutter, where a wing develops a curious kind of vibration. The guys testing the mock-up in the wind tunnel, they're trying to see whether the plane is stable, and bits would blow off, bits would break off. It was an impossible task because the wing really moved around like jello. They went through this process of having to tame the plane.
A process of trial and error revealed that the weight of the engines themselves, placed at critical points below the wing, brought the flutter under control.
They proved this crucial thing. This is a really transforming wing. This wing doubled the speed at which we could fly. And this was done by just a handful of people in that wind tunnel.
So by 1947, they were developing the world's first swept wing large aircraft, the first B-47.
And when they demonstrate the B-47 for the first time to the Air Force sent a fighter up to chase it, but it was an old generation fighter, and they lost the bomber. They couldn't find it. The bomber was faster than the fighter. That had never happened before.
Boeing got the contract to build a fleet of B-47s. But the B-47 was a military plane, not a passenger jet. The idea of a jet aircraft carrying passengers higher, faster, and farther, and in ever greater comfort, required a leap of imagination as well as technology. Bill Allen, who became Boeing's president at the end of World War II, did not fit the description of a visionary.
On the surface, he looks like a very ordinary, unremarkable accountant, lawyer, a boring kind of person. But every company that's going to be successful needs a man like Bill Allen.
Bill Allen had spent years serving as Boeing's corporate lawyer. He became the president of Boeing just as the government was canceling $1.5 billion in contracts with the company. The B-47 bomber was an exception. It was a plane that was taking the Air Force into the jet age. Bill Allen wanted it to do even more. Allen had been listening to George Schuyler and his team sing the praises of the swept-wing B-47. The jet was quieter, smoother, and much faster than any prop plane. So in the summer of 1950, Bill Allen decided to try it out for himself.
He climbed up into the belly of the beast and sat behind the pilot.
The B-47 lifted Bill Allen to an altitude thousands of feet higher than passenger planes typically traveled. And it reached speeds nearly 2 times faster, more than 600 miles an hour.
He had the jet experience for the first time. It was very quiet up there, and it was really transforming for him.
Bill Allen taking a ride in a B-47, seeing is believing. This is where passengers want to be. And if I want to be here, passengers want to be here.
But convincing airlines to believe that passenger jets were the future was another matter. They would not be eager to abandon their fleets of propeller-driven planes. And passengers, too, were wary of jets.
There was a lot of skepticism and almost fear of jet travel. People really wondered whether that was just too fast for a human being to go.
People feared traveling on planes that were using a technology that was relatively new and relatively untested. And of course, the crash of the British comets further exacerbated people's fears of flying aboard jets.
The British were actually the first to embrace the idea of a passenger jet. In 1952, they introduced a 40-seat plane called the de Havilland Comet. It was a beautiful design to look at, but the Comet was doomed.
It was an exquisitely beautiful machine, very sleek, a beauty to behold. But unknown to them and unknown to the aviation business at the time, there was a flaw in the way the fuselage was constructed.
Soon after the Comet entered service, it suffered a series of mysterious and catastrophic failures.
3 Comets crashed. And that was not actually due to the fact that they were jets.
It was because the Comet had square windows and not round ones. In the corner of the window, metal fatigue developed. And when the plane reached a certain altitude, it suffered an explosive decompression because the pressure inside the cabin found the weakness in that window frame and it exploded the cabin. The idea was bold, but the boldness exceeded the technical ability to produce a plane that fully understood the risks of high-speed flight and of flying at those altitudes.
But Bill Allen was confident that Boeing's engineers understood high-speed, high-altitude flight better than anyone.
Mr. Allen, do you think jet transportation will be readily accepted by the American public?
Martin, I have no doubt that once a person rides in a jet airliner, he will be sold on it forever. He cannot help but realize its a great superiority to what he has been used to.
So in 1952, Allen committed Boeing to the next step, building a prototype.
But the financial risk of designing just a one-off prototype were enormous. Manufacturers were used to having airlines order 30, 40, 50 aeroplanes, underwriting the cost of building the prototypes. Not only were they building an aeroplane, they were building a brand new type of aeroplane. So it was a colossal risk.
We invested in that prototype something in excess of $16 million.
A $16 million investment at that time was absolutely massive. The whole company's future pivoted on that moment.
With this prototype, they would either leapfrog the competition or end up with an airplane that nobody wanted, and nobody would pay for. Bill Allen took the biggest financial gamble in the history of aviation. He was determined to take Boeing and commercial aviation into the jet age with a plane that would become the Boeing 707.
The prototype 707 was one of the most extraordinary airplanes, not just in the history of the Boeing company, but in the history of American commercial aviation.
In May 1954, the shiny, sleek 707 prototype was wheeled out of the Boeing plant just south of Seattle, Washington. The wife of the company's founder, Bill Boeing, christened it the airplane of tomorrow. But the reality that day was that no airline had yet embraced the 707 as the future of passenger travel. Now it was the future of the Boeing company itself that was at stake. One year after its rollout, the 707 looked like a loser. No airline had stepped forward to buy the plane that Bill Allen believed was the future of commercial aviation. So in the summer of 1955, Allen enlisted Boeing's chief test pilot, Tex Johnston, to help him sell the plane.
Tex Johnston was a kind of larger-than-life, swashbuckling figure, a guy who liked to fly around in his cowboy boots and his Stetson, and he was the only person under Boeing's $18 million insurance contract who was authorized to fly that airplane.
With executives of the major airlines gathered in Seattle for industry meetings, Allen seized an opportunity and invited them to attend a popular boat race on Lake Washington.
Bill Allen was actually on a boat on Lake Washington entertaining some clients.
And Johnson was supposed to take off, fly over the races, turn around and fly back to show the airplane off to the potential customers down at the race.
He hadn't given Tex Johnson any instructions about what he's to do. It was enough for him to do a flyby over the crowd because it was a sensational enough thing to see. It was a completely new machine, very sexy, made a roar. But Tex Johnson has an idea of his own.
There were probably 350, 400,000 people gathered, in or around the lake. The airplane all of a sudden started to turn, and it almost looked like the plane might be out of control.
He's over this crowd and he decides to do a barrel roll.
Okay, we're looking good.
And Alan's heart literally stops. He calls for pills from a guy alongside him. He thinks, what on earth does Tex think he's doing?
Tex went out and he turned around and damned if he didn't come back and roll it again over the course. And I think that was when it was generally conceded that Bill Allen about had a fit.
If this thing goes out of control and crashes, it could kill thousands of people. But even if it crashed elsewhere and didn't kill a single soul, it was still going to kill the company.
And legend has it that William Allen essentially said, what do you think you're doing? Our company depends on an airplane that you just rolled. Johnson looked at him and said, well, you wanted me to sell airplanes.
The demonstration was spectacular, but airline executives still felt the leap to jets was too risky. Everyone except for Pan Am's Juan Trippe. The legendary founder of Pan American World Airways started his airline with a mail route between Florida and Cuba in 1927. A decade later, his flying boats, called Pan Am Clippers, were island hopping their way across the Pacific. He expanded Pan American into the first worldwide airline.
Trippe was the man who saw the world airline map first and what you had to do to fulfill the promise of aviation. He was a titan of the airline business. He bestrode the business as a visionary and also as an egomaniac.
The success of Pan Am was based upon Juan Trippe, the gambler. He made the most colossal gambles anybody has ever made, and he made them over and over again.
Trippe placed an order for 20 707s, but he insisted that nobody know about it. In true Trippe fashion, he wanted to enter the jet age with the greatest possible fanfare. In October 1955, there was an international aviation conference in New York. All the major airline leaders were in attendance.
And afterwards, they all came to Trippe's house. And he lets it slip that tomorrow in the paper you'll read that I've entered the jet age. They were frantic. They didn't know what to do. Every airline in the room rushed out to order the new planes. It upset the aviation world terrifically. My God, the cost to everybody was astronomical, and he forced it on them because he was first and he had enough nerve to go forward.
Rival airlines now had no choice. Enter the jet age or be left behind.
Welcome aboard the spacious cabin, attractively decorated, air-conditioned, but dry.
We would have a caviar and champagne service, and we'd have roast beef and lobster thermidor and 2 or 3 entrees to choose from. And all through, we'd be serving really, really, really good wine.
To travel on a 707, you became what was then known as the jet set, and it was the thing to do. It was popular. The Beatles travelled on 707s. The Rolling Stones travelled on 707s. And so everybody wanted to travel on 707s.
Sinatra would sing, "Come fly with me," and it created an aura, a mystery, a magic. The jet age is a very early example of brilliant marketing. It was a great piece of show business.
For the airlines and for Boeing, Bill Allen's gamble paid off.
Within a year, movement patterns over the North Atlantic had changed completely. You now had more people crossing the Atlantic by air than by sea, overturning a millennia's worth of ocean-going voyages.
Something new in the human experience was about to happen. The utility of jet travel would enable the whole world to suddenly take wing.
Juan Trippe boasted, with characteristic grandiosity, "In one fell swoop, we have shrunken the earth." But Juan Trippe and Bill Allen were not done. Higher, faster, farther. Those three words have always been what drove the progress of aviation. In 1947, Chuck Yeager broke the sound barrier in the Bell X-1. And by the 1960s, military planes were routinely traveling at supersonic speeds. But a supersonic transport, an SST, that could carry passengers across oceans and continents in only a few hours, nothing like that was yet in the skies.
In the early 60s, the British and the French took an early initiative, and they went ahead and contracted to build the Concorde.
The Concorde would be the first supersonic passenger jet.
The Kennedy administration debated, should the U.S. develop its own SST, one larger and faster and one that would trump the Concorde.
But President Kennedy had already committed the country to the most ambitious, expensive, and technologically challenging project in history, the mission to send men to the moon. He was slow to commit to the SST. But Pan American's Juan Trippe was convinced it was time for commercial jets to take the next step into the future.
Trippe was truly a visionary. He viewed supersonic flight just as he had viewed all the previous frontiers. It was the last frontier before space flight.
So Trippe set out to manipulate the President of the United States.
Juan Trippe is a very conspiratorial control freak, not a nice person, and one of his geniuses was realizing how he can manipulate everyone into giving Pan Am what Pan Am wants.
Trippe went to the competition. He made a deal to buy 6 supersonic Concordes from the French and the British for tens of millions of dollars. He then strategically leaked the news to the American press. President Kennedy was not pleased.
You can tell him I'm going to spend the next time I'm here really giving a screwing to Pan American, because that sticks it right to us.
This is the president on the phone with the administrator of the Federal Aviation Administration.
Well, now, will you give him this message from me and make it very clear that I think he ought to retract that, and he ought to wait now and see what the United States is going to do. We'll give him all the trouble he wants, because there isn't going to be anything that's going to make me more excited than doing that.
As often happened, Juan Trippe got his way.
I'm announcing today that the United States will commit itself to an important new program in civilian aviation.
The very next day, Kennedy announced his support of a plan to build an American supersonic transport.
And in supersonic flight, challenging new frontier.
Trippe at his best. I keep saying he was not a lovable man, but my God, he was good.
Boeing, Lockheed, and North American competed to get the government contract to build the SST.
Boeing won with a revolutionary design, the most amazing aeroplane.
The full-scale mock-up on display in Seattle became a destination for people in the aviation business.
Swing wing, 4 huge engines, 300 passengers, 2.5 times the speed of sound.
It was a plane that broke with the design of all previous commercial jets. But even its most ardent supporters conceded that a plane that pushed the absolute limits of technology was likely to take a decade or more to enter service. And Juan Trippe was impatient. He didn't want to wait years for his first SST. In the meantime, he wanted what he called a stopgap airplane. If he couldn't have the fastest plane in the sky, he wanted to have the biggest.
The 747 was very much a commitment to the future of air transport beyond the wildest dreams of anybody else at that time in the industry. Nobody could conceive of something that large actually being flown around the world.
The biggest aeroplane of the day was the Super DC-8, carried about 250 people. The 747 was going to carry as many as 400. It was an extraordinary leap in size. Most airline executives were just horrified at the prospect of this aeroplane. How on earth do you fill it?
Juan Trippe was convinced that if he had an airplane with double the number of seats of a 707, Pan Am could fill them and drive down the cost of air travel even further. So Trippe once again turned to Boeing and his good friend, its president, Bill Allen. Both men were in their 60s and nearing the end of long and storied careers.
The 747 is literally given birth by a conversation between these two men on a yacht. And Juan Trippe says, if you build it, I'll buy it. And Bill Allen says, in effect, I'll build it if you buy it. So, and that's done on a handshake, no more than that.
Juan Trippe signed the largest commercial contract in history for 25 747s.
Both Boeing and Pan Am bet everything on this airplane. Both would go bankrupt if it failed.
Not only had Bill Allen committed Boeing to spend billions developing the 747, he had promised Trippe that he would have his plane in less than 4 years.
When Trippe and Allen made the original handshake, they realized what they were asking for, but they didn't care. They just wanted it, you know. All the other irritating details were not theirs to worry about.
The job of turning their vision into reality fell to an engineer named Joe Sutter. Sutter had been working on jets since he started at the company almost 20 years earlier.
Joe Sutter had what would be called a very low profile. He was the guy in the back room. But he was an incredibly professional, procedural, sound engineer who everyone knew they could depend upon.
He's very retiring about his role in aviation. He says of the 747, he said, I was the only engineer left because all the smart guys were building the SST.
Juan Trippe wanted an airplane 2.5 times bigger than the current airplane, the 707 that was flying. So it was a big step forward. It wasn't a minor step at all.
It's going to be the best flying airplane that Boeing will deliver. It will have a control system and an automatic control system that's going to be second to none.
The 747 just looks like something that's 2.5 times the size of a 707, but that's very misleading. This is a completely different new plane that we have to build. I don't think anybody but Sutter at that moment realizes that fact.
And Juan Trippe's vision was for a passenger jet that would seat 400 people on 2 levels.
He was enamored with double-decking the airplane. He wanted to look like a big ocean liner. But our study said that we had a better idea.
The solution was to build an airplane that was much wider, that would seat all 400 passengers on 1 deck. It would be the first plane to have 2 aisles instead of 1.
Without there being a shout of eureka, they realized this has solved the problem. This is the way you handle the volume. There's then the political problem. Who tells Juan Trippe that he's not going to get a double-decker?
My own management decided I was going to be too much of a hard sell, so Milt Heinemann, who worked for me, we appointed him to present the case to Pan Am.
Then he takes the plane to New York, goes to the Pan Am building, into the conference room where he's going to meet Trippe and all the yes men surrounding Trippe. And he measures the width of the room, and it's 20 feet, almost exactly. So he's able to use this wonderful phrase when he says to Trippe, you are sitting inside a 747 in this room.
trip, gave up the idea of a double-decker. But he was convinced that once Boeing's supersonic transport was delivered, the 747 would be relegated to hauling cargo.
So we had to design the airplane to be a good freighter as well as a good passenger airplane. It was the only airplane ever that was designed to that double requirement. But how do you load that freight? One way is to load it through the nose, so we put a nose door on the airplane. That, of course, was where the cockpit should be. So that's why we put the cockpit above. That's why it has a hump. It's because we're designing a freight version of the airplane.
The 747 would be the largest and most complex passenger aircraft ever built. In size and ambition, it now rivaled even the SST. But the U.S. taxpayer was underwriting the development of the SST. The 747 was being developed with Boeing's own money, and it was running out.
The program's costing $5 million a day. There's never been a program that cost $5 million a day in 1968, 69. It's unheard of. They have to keep going back to the bank and asking for more money. It's literally a race against time to keep the company solvent and deliver the plane.
There's a lot of pressure to reduce costs. Bill Allen asked for a meeting to prepare himself to go back to talk to the bankers to borrow more money. The management decided that I had too many engineers. I could drop 1,000 engineers. That would have been a disaster. I couldn't get rid of 1,000 engineers. I needed 800 more. There are times when you have to step up and try and hit the ball no matter what the pitch looks like. I had to make a decision. Do I tell the truth or do I cover it up? I told the truth, figuring this was my last day at Boeing.
It was not Joe Sutter's last day at Boeing, and he kept his engineers. But their deadline remained the same, to get a 747 airborne in less than 4 years. On February 9, 1969, the 747, the world's first wide-body commercial aircraft, was on the runway and cleared to fly for the first time.
No one had seen an airline of this size leave the ground. Every airplane builder will tell you that however confident they are, when the tire leaves the tarmac is the real test.
It was common to read in publications, I don't believe you can get that big an airplane in the air. It overwhelmed people, the size of it. There was a huge turnout. Press from all over the world, airline customers from all over the world, they're waiting to see the first flight of this incredible new airplane.
Brian Weigel, Jack Waddell, and Jesse Wallach were the crew chosen to fly the 747.
The three of us that made that first flight, we knew it was a momentous moment and felt the responsibility of, getting it right.
There was a great deal of expectation, and it was a typical Seattle morning, a little bit misty, a little bit damp. The plane rolls down the runway. It lifts off and it's impeccable.
I think the relief of getting it in the air after all the struggles that got on, we were actually airborne, was a great moment. The three of us at that moment felt a great wave of exultation.
It's a very easily flyable airplane, though, and it doesn't want to touch roll.
Everything looks very normal on the right side, Jack.
Beautiful.
When you spend 3 years working like a dog to get something done and you see it's successful, you get a sense of accomplishment and pride. I felt the gang of guys that worked for me had really done a hell of a good job, so I felt pretty good.
Jack was doing the landing, and I think we all had the same thought. Let's not screw up.
Hi, Al. Jack, how are you? Natural question is, what are your impressions? I guess this sounds complacent or something, but that thing is just ridiculously easy to fly. It's just a pilot's dream.
The 747 embodied everything aviation had become. The science, the engineering, the relentless pace of innovation were all there in Joe Sutter's huge machine. The plane that was supposed to revolutionize the design of the passenger jet, the SST, was never built. Costs had skyrocketed, and Congress dropped all funding. The mock-up went to a museum. Almost half a century since its first flight, the 747 is still in production and in service around the world, the most recognizable aircraft in the sky. It remains a symbol of the jet age and the promise of universal travel.
It just changed the paradigm for not only business, but also human-to-human contact. And it all really began with the decision to develop a jet-powered airliner with a swept wing.
It's just amazing to me as an aeronautical engineer that here it is 60, 70 years later, and I just flew back from Brussels on in this case, it was a Boeing 777. Essentially the same design as the B-47. That design configuration was so fundamentally right. Why change it? You know, the old expression, if it's not broken, don't fix it, I think holds. To this day,